Welcome back to Munro Live, everybody. Today we have the Kia EV6. It was provided as a press vehicle to us, and I have Kevin Hardy with me. And today we're going to go over everything we see on the underbody. Now, an interesting thing about the Kia EV6, it shares a platform with the Hyundai Ioniq 5. So this is the EV6, Hyundai Ioniq 5, very similar. So there is some stuff that we're going to see that's very common to that vehicle that we already reviewed. But let's get into this and we'll show you what we found is a little bit different. So Kevin, what's the first thing you noticed on the battery pack? I don't remember seeing this on the other one.
It is on the other one, so having extrusions encapsulating your battery is very common. And then they're cutting off here, they're chamfering the edges, so you have a nice smooth length of line for this, for abrasion, things of that nature. But they are machining these windows here, and depending on which way you look, Zach, you can start to see like weld penetration. So it's present here, it's present on essentially each of these joints. And that's what I think we would surmise. It's either quality control, so they can see what type of weld penetration they have, if they need to come back through and clean it up or do anything like that. It's very common to have manual, welding repairs on some of these battery packs after the robots kind of go through the initial pass. But that's, that's one of the little things that we can kind of talk about and draw out in comparison to the Ioniq 5. Yeah, so,
yeah, and on the rear EDM, here's something that we noticed is that this mounting provision is a separate part, but this one over here is integrated to the right side of the casting. Now, we recently reviewed the Mercedes-Benz EQS, and we really liked how integrated all the mounting provisions were in that, particularly the carrier for the bearing on the half shaft. And notice this is what we typically see. We typically see the carrier for the bearing on the half shaft on the long side be a separate part. So this is normal. That Mercedes we really liked. Nothing groundbreaking here or anything. But when I say the long side, so you have your motor over here, your gearbox over here, and it's offset. So one half shaft will be shorter than the other. I know when we looked at the Rivian, that was actually centered. So they had two motors, two gearboxes, but the links were actually equal. Similar to the Mercedes, we see these small pencil braces, we call them. These are stamped steel pencil braces that will draw in and connect this point, point A to point B, and this point from here to here. It allows you to really box in the structure of the cradle without compromising your ability to install the drive unit. Material choices, once again, common to the Hyundai Ioniq 5. Complicated pieces and parts with unique shapes. They've chosen to go to, looks like a forged aluminum piece.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, Zach, get in here. You can see the forged line right here. If you ever held a wrench in your hand, it'll have a very similar feature on the side because typically wrenches are forged. And the choices for many of the other links are clamshell welded on the upper and a simple stamped steel hat section on this lower, and clamshell welded on this link over here. The battery itself is covered by a similar shield. It's a composite. This would make a decent amount of noise if you had rocks or debris coming up hitting this, because it's a harder outer surface. But what else do you see, Kevin?
So if you kind of come around here, Zach, I don't recall this being on the Ioniq. So there is a cast welding provision here. I can only surmise that not only are there mounting provisions here that they might have to add, but this is done for NVH. It's not present in the other one. If you recall in the previous video, there was also dampeners on the dampener assemblies, the shock bodies themselves. I think definitely in the front, and I think as well on the rear. Not present on this vehicle, so that is kind of something that's interesting. We were wondering if we would see them on different versions or different trim levels. That's a little insight on the Hyundai, not on the Kia. But this has been added, so they might be tuning, or there might be something slightly different about this vehicle that is maybe have a requirement for a certain decibel rating or whatever they're trying to do that's slightly different with this, that they need this, or this is a running change that's been added, and if we had a current production Ioniq, this may have the same thing as well. Let's see.
And so this is our fourth Hyundai or Kia product. So we had the Kona and the Nero first a couple years ago, and those are older, and now we have the Ioniq 5 and the EV6. And one thing I like to see is the commonality between those two. And also the fact that Hyundai and Kia were willing to change and update their architecture moving forward. So I suspect that these same architectures and drive units can be used on their mid or medium-sized SUVs. So if we get an SUV or even a minivan version of this, they can use these same drive units because the amount of power and output that they are generating can fit in the rear of anything on this top hat or not top hat, skateboard. Top hat would be what goes on top of the skateboard. Let's see. Let's go to the front real quick.
Okay.
We pointed this out last time, but it has the same common huge stamped steel brace that goes across. Now, the purpose of this, having worked with many OEMs and sat through SORB mitigation strategies. Now, SORB is small overlap rigid barrier, and it's essentially a test that they send all vehicles through both sides where they'll engage 25% of the vehicle. So 40% would be about here. That typically always engaged the traditional rail position. But when they moved to 25%, that put more energy over a smaller area. So more energy, smaller area. They really had a lot of problems where the energy would essentially be unabated. It would miss the cradle, it would hit the wheel, and essentially send it into the cabin. And what a lot of different manufacturers have done to help mitigate that is they've widened the width of the front of the cradle, but you can't just widen it because sometimes this structure, when engaged, because it doesn't have support directly behind it, will bend really quickly. So when you engage this portion of the rail of the cradle right here, can you see this right here? These two massive bolts and this huge thick stamping, I forget how thick it was like
I think 4.3 is what.
Yeah, 4 millimeters. As this tries to crumple and bend, this will be in tension and essentially be pulling across the entire car to help absorb that energy of that crash. Now, it's not just to pass the crash test. It's a really important safety countermeasure for a small overlap impact. That would be like if you're driving down the road and someone crosses the center line and you barely hit another car. Vehicles are so much safer now. 2016 or 2018, they started meeting this requirement, but now pretty much all vehicles try and achieve a really good rating for the SORB test. So I know sometimes we throw out acronyms here on Munro Live and we don't really define what they mean, but Munro has a huge history in studying previous architectures to help our clients with different strategies. And this is a strategy I've actually seen before. I've seen large martensitic beams up front because you really have to start the energy absorption right here. Go ahead, Kevin.
No, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, especially on the Tesla. These structural elements are the beginnings of they're balancing a little bit, but of a more offensively oriented strategy. So prior to this, if you saw like a Kia, like a Palisade, older ones, probably like 2019 or so, or what's
Santa
the other
Fe?
one? Not the Santa Fe, the other larger SUV.
Tucson?
Nope, we'll go through them all.
Telluride,
yeah. So it did not have a perimeter cradle. It had a relatively small, I don't want to say K-member, but a very small, very small cradle. And essentially it was managing all that energy in the motor bay rails themselves, the hinge pillar, and some of this torque box structure, reinforcing your A-pillars and your rockers. And they had a very defensive strategy. And we kind of talked about that again with the Tesla. It's great because all your weight is back behind the front axle. The customer gets to use that weight while they're driving around in a number of situations besides just small overlap, but it's difficult because there's only so much you can do, especially as vehicles start getting heavier with these batteries, EVs specifically. This has helped balancing out that strategy of engaging your primary engine bay rail, because this is all tied to that, and then have a much wider crush can. Actually, there's some interesting features on this one if you want to kind of take a look at it. But they're starting to balance that offensive and defensive strategy. You see the aluminum crush can there? So they have some features here, at least. So these, these are being passed through kind of like a Play-Doh toy. The aluminum is being shot through in the extrusion. And then they have I don't want to say splayed stanchion, but they have a surface that's coming off here, and they're coming through and milling this. So you can see how this radius sweeps out, and it's very deliberate, probably where I'm not sure how long that is, I can't really see, but they are bringing that radius outwards and supporting essentially the mounting flange of the crush can, and they do have these local features to kind of get some more rigidity, potentially in those areas for some linear crush. So.
All right, shifting gears real quick, I want to talk about some of the thermal system components we can see here. So here's a pump. Notice it's a disassociated pump. So what I mean by disassociated, it's not integrated into any other valve or valve body or super manifold or anything. It is by itself. It has a steel strap clamped around an aluminum housing, bolted to an aluminum bracket that is then isolated from the aluminum housing of the EDM, the electric drive module. So an amazing amount of bracketry, isolation, and fasteners just to have this pump essentially out in the open. And then look at the inefficiency of the routing. You come out and the first thing it does is take a 90-degree right angle to then take a sweeping 90-degree right, back to then flow all the way back to probably, these lines. Nope, it comes over here and it flows into the battery. So you have positive to the battery. Notice a small temperature sensor here. So this is your temp sense before entry to the battery. And this is most likely your return from out of the battery. So in and out. These two lines most likely flow down outside the battery all the way to the back. We don't have to walk back here, but they are going to the rear EDM, the plate heat exchanger for the gear oil, or the inverter, or both. I'd have to look at the full routing. But essentially we have seen improvements in the connection type. So notice that these are nylon lines. They're hard plastic.
Lighter,
they're lighter, they're harder. You do not have to add rub provisions to them like you typically do with rubber or EPDM lines. Right as I say that, I see that they added one right here. So, okay, so it's not always the case, but these lines are what we saw Tesla lead with in late 2017, early 2018, when it was a 100% PA, polyamide 11 or 12 lines, so nylon. And we've seen some improvements because I know that the previous Hyundai and Kias that we saw use traditional lines and constant tension spring clamps, but still seeing a pump floating out essentially in the open with an amazing amount of bracketry and poorly routed lines just makes me cringe. But I know that these are COTS, commercial off-the-shelf products. So these are produced in bulk by many of the tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers.
And this is something like in general we're dealing with a lot of our customers. And they're trying to balance that. So they come to us and like, listen, there's a lot to be said because you have routing, you have fasteners, you have weights of brackets. When you start rolling all these things up, there's a lot of cost there. And the advantage of buying, potentially this unit in bulk starts to diminish, especially when you start talking about like the overall weight of the vehicle, the assembly cost of the vehicle, and things of that nature. So they're not on an island with respect to that. I think a lot of the customers that we have are struggling to deal with this. Like, they're trying to make the next leap for the next mid-cycle action in 2 years or something like that, or are they working on essentially building something for 5 or 6 years out where they can integrate everything into a really nice manifold setup. So it's not uncommon to see this. It's just...
And what makes Kevin and my job really, really interesting is that an electric vehicle at the very base level is very simple. You have batteries, electric motors, you have an inverter, and you have a gearbox, axles, and wheels. I have a little RC car, and it is exactly that. It has a lithium polymer battery, it has a brushless motor, it has a tiny little inverter, and a little gearbox, and some axles. But it's all the tiny, minute differences that we see in execution from OEM to OEM to OEM. There are major differences when you roll them all up. So when you roll up all those tiny little paper cuts, it can factor into the the weight of the amount of fluid you have in the vehicle, the cost associated with assembling the vehicle. So that's something that's oftentimes overlooked is with all this complexity, you're adding in potential for quality errors, rubs, scratches, leaks, all sorts of stuff. We had that Mercedes EQS in, and lo and behold, it had a small coolant leak in. So $135,000 vehicle, and it already had a small coolant leak. So when you reduce complexity, you reduce the amount of opportunities for error. So sorry for the little soapbox speech on what we do, but that's why we're so intently focused on these tiny details, because they really are important to how we operate, how we learn, how we get better, and how we help our clients. Anything else you see up here, Kevin?
No, I mean, it's for the other kind of more like higher level things, you can look at the Ionic video. It's pretty much, almost identical going through. There's no mass dampeners, we kind of pointed that out. This is, and I think the Mercedes, we didn't get to that point, but it had, we have polymer splash shields in the front, PET in the rear. This is a rear drive biased vehicle, so as far as take rate.
I did notice that it's not a full coverage wheel liner. Did you notice that?
Yeah, they're exposing.
Part of the wheel well is exposed, and it's not something you typically see. We've seen usually 100% covered wheel wells for a long time.
No, you're right. I mean, they are applying, you can kind of see here like
LASD.
Yeah, that's probably the best way to phrase it for this. And that's been common, especially on a lot of like Pacific OEM vehicles in general, to kind of mitigate rust and things of that nature. But they definitely scaled back the amount of coverage in comparison to like a lot of other vehicles that we see on the road now. But I guess the beauty of it is it is simple. Like in general, when I don't want to say so cheap. It's efficient. You use a lot of steel. There's no cast aluminum shock towers. There's no extrusions in the body. No mixed material. It's very, very basic. But essentially they've got a '90s vehicle as far as a body structure, honed extremely well in terms of weight. They're extremely competitive in that regard, and they can spend a lot of money in other areas that, we are talking about nuts and bolts. But on the interior side, they can spend a little bit more money and give the customer a relatively premium, experience for not a lot of money. So.
That's a really great point, because about the 90s vehicle, I had a 1991 Nissan Maxima. Actually, I had 4 or 5 of them. And I laid underneath those, working on those a ton. And what did I have? I had a McPherson strut, stamped steel, welded lower control arm with a serviceable ball joint. Now, what I mean by that is you're able to unbolt the ball joint from the lower control arm. It was something that I really liked because I had ball joint replacement issues on that vehicle. But it's like, do you build in the serviceability, or oftentimes we see the ball joint integrated into this piece where if you have a failure after 120 or 200,000 miles, you got to replace the whole arm. I like the fact that it still kind of harkens back to some of those 90s designs with a stamped steel McPherson strut, but I don't know. It's pretty well executed. And I don't know, it's hard for us to get more and more out of this because we did a vehicle that was so similar just recently.
It's like the 5th time we've talked about something. Their architecture in general.
But Kevin, why don't you talk about the styling a little bit? I know that Sandy's has done or is going to do the first impressions, but what'd you think of it?
I mean, overall it's very dramatic. It's not necessarily for me. I'm a little more conservative in some regards with styling. One thing I think is interesting with I think just in general with the kind of this trend of vehicles with these EVs, and the EQS does the exact same thing. There's almost no front fender at all. I'm not sure how I feel about this body breakup line where you have a very small fender, the hood completely overlaps and encompasses much of that body panel exterior. But in general, they've kind of been known for their style, where they're bringing like lighting elements and things of that nature from the lights themselves and carry them over to body part lines. I think the thing that's kind of interesting, it's pretty aggressive in the rear. They've got the tail light going up into like a duckbill spoiler. It's drastic. I think it's definitely oriented to maybe like a younger crowd, where the Hyundais are maybe in some ways more premium or a little bit more conservative kind of going through it. But
all right, I think this wraps up our quick overview of the underbody of the Kia EV6. And a couple little things, reminders. We have a Patreon account. Thank you to the 300 to 400 people who are our patrons, and we're actually revamping what we do there. A ton of behind the scenes footage will be uploaded at a much more frequent rate. We're also going to interact more with our patrons on what we should do for content, how we should develop some of our thumbnails, and we actually hired a new full-time person that'll be adding more content to Patreon. So if you're interested in being a little bit more part of the team, there's a link in the description where you can go to Patreon, and I think it's anywhere from $5 to $10 a month. You can be part of that team. Also, we have Sandy Munro bobbleheads that are almost sold out. We only ordered 100 of those. If you want 25% off anything in the Munro Live store, so this is on munrolive.com, not the t-shirt store on the YouTube channel, use the word plaid out at checkout. So I know that coupon code was really popular. I mentioned it a few weeks ago, and a lot of people were happy to get 25% off a bunch of stuff that they had been wanting to purchase from the Munro Live store. But thank you for watching. We really appreciate all the subscribers out there as we approach 300,000 subscribers. So we appreciate everybody who has subscribed. That's all I have. Anything else, Kevin?
No, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, bye.